let's start straight away. Let's get straight into it. Let's talk about. Let's start with Hilary and talking about the Guardian piece. I'll just give you a little intro, and then we're going to get straight into it. Okay, so UK facing risk of systemic economic crisis. Official paper says. The government has privately admitted that the UK faces an increased likelihood of systemic economic crisis as it completes its exit from the European Union in the middle of a second wave of the coronavirus pandemic. A confidential cabinet briefing seen by The Guardian also warns of a notable risk that in the coming months, the country could face a perfect storm of simultaneous disasters, including the prospect of a bad flu season on top of the medical strains caused by COVID. Winter 2020 could see a combination of severe flooding, pandemic influenza, a novel emerging infectious disease, and coordinated industrial action against a backdrop of the end of the Brexit transition period, it warns. So we're joined by Hilary Wainwright from Red Pepper to talk about this. Hilary, isn't this just a stressing point? Isn't this just a civil service outline of the worst case scenarios that civil servants prepare for all the time? I think we need to turn you off mute if we can.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Oh.
No.
Yeah. Go on.
Okay. So, yes, I mean, in one sense, that's all it is on paper. But the fact that The Guardian makes it public, I think, is important because, in a way, these are documents governing or influencing government decisions. And they should be open and they should be debated and they should be part of the public argument. I think it's outrageous that, all these in a way, it's nothing new. I mean, you don't have to be terribly intelligent to kind of actually know that there's going to be these systemic crises. But in a way, the detail of the thinking of the civil service is important for us to know because that helps us both know what's influencing the government, know the options, and be better informed, better, forearmed, in order to actually hold the government to account. So I think it's important that it's been made public. So, good on The Guardian for that.
Guardian do a lot of stuff bringing lots of stories to light, but isn't this an example of sort of agenda-driven reporting? I think many would claim that this is the kind of non-story that's blown out of proportion just to make the government look bad because that's what The Guardian like to do. They're not clearly fans of the Conservative government.
Well, I think it's not. I mean, journalism isn't just about judgment. It's also about information and the resource that information and knowledge can provide for citizens to take action and to think strategically, and also in a way, I was going to say to influence government, but that would presume we lived in a democracy, which we don't. And so, actually, the fact that we've got this information and people, have got many thoughts about what could be done and how this crisis could be avoided, how ordinary people needn't suffer from the money that's had to be spent to address our health needs. But, there's no way in which the government's going to take account of public opinion other than if there's real pressure and real power. And so this kind of information helps us build that power and prepare for this kind of systemic crisis.
Well, we're talking about the crises. There's quite a lot of detail in the report and in the article. What do you think the key crises are? What are the major ones that were outlined there, and which to you seem most likely to be, to occur and to negatively affect us?
Well, I think interestingly, the ones that are listed are very much ones that imply that the threat is from the outside. So the pandemic, new diseases, the sort of problems of Brexit caused by other governments caused by the EU. There's very little sense of what the government is doing that's contributing to those crises. So I think that the obviously the pandemic and the consequences of COVID for our health is a sort of overshadowing crisis, but also, you know, we're aware that the government has handled this absolutely kind of, you know, irresponsibly, right from the slowness of the initial lockdown, the kind of failure of the test and trace, the kind of lifting of the lockdown without any preparations for the test and trace, other than, you know, private contracts, which have proved to be a complete failure, as we could have predicted, because they're not using the knowledge of our public servants, particularly local government, you know, the whole kind of public health infrastructure that exists in local government. So that's going to be an overriding shadow. But then also the consequences of COVID in terms of the economy is going to mean that people, in a way, it makes the health crisis worse, because people are in such a precarious situation economically that they'll go to work even if they're sick. And this is going to be particularly true in the public sector. I'm not thinking so much of the health sector, but education and all the other parts of the public sector, which are so crucial in this crisis, but are not going to get the pay rise that they deserve. So I think the convergence of the economic crisis and COVID, and then obviously the economic crisis will be massively exacerbated by Brexit, which, you know, is an own goal by this government.
Well, I was going to ask before I bring everyone else in what you think the key causes for these crises will be. And I think you've talked about how it's being positioned as external factors. You know, we're in the middle of COVID, and I think there are vast swathes of the public that give the government, actually, they say, well, no one would know what we're dealing with, and they give Johnson and the government a bit of leeway there. But there's other things, like I saw.
They did. I'm not sure they do now. They did at the beginning.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, is this the case, you think? Because, for instance, I feel like there's also other things on top of COVID. For instance, Matt Hancock talked about how the British are peculiar in going back to work when they're ill. But then, if you look at comparative sort of sick pay rates to, say, continental Europe, Germans get 100% of their pay if they have sick days. We get around about 29%, and that's for those of us who are employed, because a great deal of us are self-employed and don't get any sick pay, and that's why people work when sick, and is particularly disastrous in a pandemic. Are there any other key causes that you can see for these potential crises that are coming, you know, potentially coming down the line for us?
Well, I think perhaps the fundamental cause that must be placed at the foot of the government is the failure to use and develop the public sector and actually our public infrastructure, which is so, you know, which was invented and developed to save us from these kinds of crises, from health threats, from the instability of employment through the market. You know, so the cuts in benefits, the sort of weakness of the furlough system, the way that a lot of precarious workers, self-employed workers, are not being helped. Many small businesses are not being helped. And then I think most fatally, you know, the test and trace system, which, you know, we know from other countries can work. You know, it can be done, but this has all been put into the hands of a company, Serco, that actually, you know, has got none of this accumulated knowledge that our public health infrastructure has at a local level. So I think it's, in a way, it's very ideological. I think it's this sort of belief in the market and the sort of and private enterprise that's meant that all our public capacities, including the capacities of the people. I mean, you know, if you just think about all that mutual aid that's gone on And actually, I was thinking as I was reading that article that maybe some of that, the lessons learnt during the COVID crisis and the public response to it, the public solutions that people have been inventing in the face of the government failure, could become quite important in dealing with the consequences of Brexit. For example, the food system, the food chains, clearly for many people they've not been adequate during the crisis, the health crisis. So people have turned to, local producers, all kinds of ethical and organic and sort of green kinds of production of local food, of chickens, of eggs, of of vegetables and so on. And there's a whole sort of new food chain emerging, which I think could be important in developing our resilience in the face of a completely irresponsible trade policy.